The day Clark McCrae rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, every soul on the main street found somewhere urgent to be, except for one woman standing in the doorway of the apothecary's shop, arms folded, watching him like he was nothing more remarkable than a passing cloud. That was the thing that undid him, though he would not fully understand it until much later. He had ridden 300 miles out of Texas with a reputation that arrived in towns before he ever did, carried on the lips of drovers and telegraph operators, and the kind of men who made their living knowing other men's worst moments. The name Clark McCrae meant something in 1878, and not the kind of something that made respectable people comfortable. He had ridden the Kishom Trail 4 times. He had worked cattle from the Gulf Coast to the Kansas railheads. He had been in 3 gunfights, survived all 3, and buried one of his closest friends in the Texas brush country after a run-in with a cattle baron's hired men. The violence had not made him cruel, but it had made him hard in the way that rough weather makes old wood hard, so that the grain shows deeper and you can see exactly what the tree went through to become what it is. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, and the kind of quiet that people mistook for menace. He wore a dark brown hat with a sweat-stained brim and a Colt revolver on his right hip that he had not drawn in over a year. He had come to Caldwell for one reason. He was done with the trail, and he wanted to hire on with a legitimate ranching operation that might one day let him settle somewhere long enough to plant something and watch it grow. He was not looking for trouble. He never was, but trouble had a way of finding men like him the same way water found low ground. The town of Caldwell sat near the Kansas and Indian Territory border, a place that was equal parts civilization and wildness, where cattle money mixed with homesteader debt, and where the law was only as reliable as the man currently wearing the badge. The main street had a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Bell, a livery stable, a land office, the apothecary where the woman was standing, a barber shop, and a hotel that had seen better decades. There was also a small church at the far end of the street, its white paint peeling in long strips from the Kansas wind. Clark rode slowly down the center of the street, feeling the familiar prickling awareness of being watched. He had felt it in a dozen towns. Usually it meant men stepping back into doorways and women pulling children close. He had learned to let his eyes move without moving his head, checking shadows and second-floor windows out of habit more than genuine fear. What he saw was the expected scattering. Shop doors closing. A man at the barber's window pressing himself back into the dark interior. A woman on the opposite boardwalk gathering her skirts and retreating inside the milliner's without a backward look. And then there was her. She was standing in the open doorway of the apothecary, and she was not retreating at all. She was watching him with calm, direct, dark eyes under a pair of straight black brows, and her expression held no fear whatsoever. She was perhaps 24 or 25, wearing a practical gray dress with the sleeves pushed to her elbows, and a white apron tied at her waist that had a smear of something green across the hem. Her dark brown hair was pinned up simply, though 2 curling strands had escaped to hang along her jaw. She was not beautiful in the way that saloon paintings were beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that the countryside was beautiful, in a way that required you to actually look. Clark McCrae had not been looked at calmly in so long that the experience stopped him in the middle of the street. His horse, a blue roan gelding named Roscoe, planted his feet and flicked an ear, wondering why they had stopped moving. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if curious about what he might do next. Then she turned and went back inside her shop without any particular hurry. Clark sat there another moment, staring at the empty doorway. Then he rode on to the livery stable, dismounted, handed Roscoe over to the stable boy, and stood in the warm smell of hay and horse wondering what in the world had just happened to his chest. He found a room at the hotel, washed the trail from his face, and went down to the Dusty Bell for a meal. The saloon went quieter when he walked in, the way saloons did, but he ignored it and found a table near the wall where he could see the room. He ordered beans and cornbread and black coffee, ate alone, and listened to the conversations carefully threading around him as people decided whether or not to pretend he was not there. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Walt with a red beard, eventually brought the coffee over himself and stood with his arms crossed. It was not a hostile stance exactly, more assessing. "You passing through?" Walt asked. "Depends," Clark said. "On what?" "On whether there's a reason to stay. I'm looking to hire on with a good ranching outfit, something with a future attached to it." Walt studied him for a moment. "You're McCrae." "I am. I heard things." "Most people have," Clark said, and he said it without defensiveness, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had made peace with his history. "None of them change what I just told you." Walt seemed to weigh this. "There's the Ramsey place about 6 miles east. Widow runs it. She might be looking for a hand, I don't know. Her regular man left 2 weeks ago, took off for Colorado. It's a small operation, but it's solid." Clark looked up. "Ramsey. Cora Ramsey. She's been out there 3 years since her husband died. Keeps it going herself mostly with her foreman, old Pete Briggs, and a boy named Eli. But she's short-handed now, and spring drives are coming." Clark thought about the woman in the apothecary doorway. Dark eyes, straight black brows, the apron with the green smear. "She run the apothecary shop in town?" he asked, and he tried to make it sound like a practical question. Walt looked at him with a flicker of surprise. "She does 3 days a week. Trained under her father, who was a physician out of Missouri." "Why?" "Just asking," Clark said, and looked back at his coffee. He thought about it for the rest of the evening, sitting alone in his hotel room while the Kansas wind moved through the gaps in the window frame. He thought about riding out to the Ramsey Ranch in the morning, and he told himself it was entirely because he needed work and Walt had said she was short-handed. He told himself there was no other reason. He almost believed it. In the morning he dressed, buckled on his gun belt with the careful automatic habit of a man who had been doing it for 11 years, and rode Roscoe east along the rutted wagon road that cut through the tall spring grass. The Ramsey spread announced itself with a split-rail fence in good repair, and a stand of cottonwood trees along a creek that sparkled cold and clear in the morning light. The house was modest but well-maintained, white clapboard with a covered porch, running its full length and flower boxes beneath the front windows that held some tenacious early growth, despite the unpredictable Kansas spring. There was a barn painted red and a bunkhouse and 2 corrals, one holding 6 horses and the other 3 good-looking young steers. Clark reined in at the gate and looked the place over. He could tell things about a spread just by looking, the same way a doctor reads a face. This one said, "Not wealthy but disciplined. Someone here cared." He dismounted and led Roscoe through the gate, and before he had taken 10 steps a voice said, "Can I help you?" He turned toward the barn, and there she was again. Cora Ramsey was standing at the barn door with a bridle in her hands that she had clearly just been mending, a length of leather stitching tool tucked into her apron pocket. She was wearing a different dress today, a plain blue one under a heavy canvas apron, and her hair was tucked under a wide-brimmed hat that was purely practical and had nothing to do with fashion. She looked at him with exactly the same directness she had shown in the apothecary doorway. No fear. No deference, not hostile either, simply steady. "Clark McCrae," he said, removing his hat. "Walt over at the Dusty Bell said you might be looking for an experienced hand." She looked at him for a long moment, not through him, not past him, directly at him as though she was reading something. "I know who you are," she said. "I expect so. Do you also know what people say about you?" "Most of it," he said. "Some of it's true, some of it grew in the telling." "Which parts are true?" she asked, and the question was blunt and genuine, with no attempt to soften it. He had never been asked that before. Not directly, face to face, by someone who seemed to actually want an accurate answer. Turned his hat in his hands once. "The gunfights are true. I didn't start any of them. 2 of them I wish hadn't happened, and 1 of them I'd do again. The story about the Decker Ranch in Texas is true, though they leave out the part where Decker's men were running stolen horses and I was the one who caught them at it. The part about me being a hired killer is not true. I have never shot a man for money." She considered this for another moment. Then she said, "Can you work cattle?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you mend fence?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you take direction from a woman without making it difficult?" He met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "I've got no pride about who gives the orders as long as the orders make sense." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one, a small softening around the corners of her mouth that she appeared to be holding in check. "Room and board and $12 a month," she said. "You'll bunk with Pete Briggs and Eli Hooper. I expect honest work and I expect honesty. That second one matters more to me than the first." "Understood," he said. "You can put your horse in the left corral and get settled in the bunkhouse. We start at sunup." She turned back to the barn without ceremony. Clark stood there for a moment, hat in hand in the mild spring morning, and felt something that he had not felt in a long time. It was not happiness exactly. It was the quieter thing underneath happiness, the recognition that a thing might be beginning. He put his hat back on and led Roscoe to the corral. Pete Briggs turned out to be 63 years old, wiry and weathered as old fence wire, with a gray beard he kept trimmed and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had worked cattle since he was 15 years old and had been with Cora Ramsey. For 2 of the 3 years she had been running the place, having worked for her husband before that. He shook Clark's hand with a grip that said he still had plenty of use left in him. "McCrae," Pete said, studying him, "I heard of you. People keep saying that. You here to work?" "I am." "Then we'll get along fine," Pete said simply, and went back to repairing a section of rope harness. Eli Hooper was 19 years old, sandy-haired and earnest, with the kind of wide-open face that had not yet learned to guard itself. He looked at Clark with frank admiration that Clark found embarrassing. "Is it true you drew against 3 men in Abilene?" Eli asked at supper that first evening. "No," Clark said. "It was 1 man in Abilene, 2 were in Laredo, and I'd rather talk about something else." Eli deflated slightly but nodded. Pete caught Clark's eye across the small bunkhouse table and gave him a nod of what might have been approval. The work began the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the flat horizon, and Clark found his footing in it quickly. He knew cattle. He knew fence and horses and land, and after 3 days Pete Briggs was watching him with a different kind of assessment, the kind a craftsman gives someone who clearly knows the craft. What Clark did not know how to handle was Cora Ramsey. She was everywhere on that ranch in a way he had not quite expected. She was not a distant owner who handed down instructions from a porch. She was in the barn at sunrise checking on a mare with a sore left forefoot. She was out along the east fence line on a black horse named Duchess, riding the perimeter to check for breaks with the same systematic attention to detail she apparently brought to everything. She was at the corral watching Eli work a young horse with corrections that were precise and never unkind. She was at the kitchen house in the evenings, and sometimes the smell of whatever she was cooking for supper drifted across the yard and made the bunkhouse feel warmer than the wood stove entirely accounted for. She spoke to Clark with exactly the same manner she had used at the gate: direct, practical, fair. She never spoke down to him and never spoke up to him either. She asked his opinion on the sore-footed mare and listened carefully when he gave it. She disagreed with him about the best route for moving the young steers to the north pasture, laid out her reasoning clearly, and turned out to be right. She thanked him when he caught a fence break that might have let cattle drift into the Indian Territory boundary, which would have caused complicated legal trouble. She did not flirt with him. She did not soften herself for him. She treated him exactly as she treated Pete Briggs, except that he was new and Pete was not, so she explained more. And this was the problem. Because Clark was paying attention to her with an intensity that he was working hard to keep from being obvious, and the more he watched her the more he found. He found that she hummed quietly to herself when she was working alone, half-tunes that she seemed to improvise as she went. He found that she brought 3 books with her when she rode out on long days, tucked in her saddlebag, and read during the rest stops. He found that she had learned her medicine from her father, who had died 2 years before her husband, and that she kept the apothecary not just for income, but because the nearest actual doctor was in Wichita, 40 miles north, and the people of Caldwell needed someone. He found that she was not a woman who had ended up running a ranch by accident or by default, but a woman who had made deliberate choices and then thrown herself into executing them with her whole self. He found, watching her kneel in the dirt to examine a cow's hoof one Tuesday morning, her hat on the ground beside her and the April wind pulling strands loose from her braid, that he was in more trouble than he had been in since Laredo, and that felt like an exceptionally odd comparison. He also found, over the course of those first 2 weeks, that the reputation preceding him in Caldwell was causing problems. It started with the Dalton brothers. There were 3 of them, Hayes, Boyd, and the youngest one who went by the name Scratch, and they were not the famous outlaws, but they aspired to that kind of influence. They ran a small but aggressive cattle operation north of town, used methods that the neighboring homesteaders found troubling, and had a long-standing interest in acquiring the Ramsey property because of the creek that crossed her land, and provided the best reliable water access for miles in any direction. They had attempted to buy it from Cora twice. She had declined both times. Since then things had become less pleasant. Clark heard about most of this from Pete Briggs on a slow afternoon when they were re-roofing a section of the barn. Hayes Dalton came out last fall and made her an offer she called insultingly low, Pete said, passing up a bundle of cedar shingles. She told him she wasn't interested at any price. He told her a woman running land alone was bound to run into difficulties, and she told him she wasn't alone and that he should take his horse off her property before she fetched her rifle. Clark accepted the shingles. Did she have a rifle? She absolutely had a rifle, and she can shoot it too. Hayes left, came back in January with his brother Boyd and the same offer. Turned them down again. Since then they've been making small nuisances of themselves. Found a section of fence cut clean 2 weeks before you came. 3 calves drifted before we found them. Clark was quiet for a moment, tacking a shingle into place. She knows it's them. She knows and can't prove it. Sheriff Meade in town is a decent man, but he needs evidence, and the Daltons know how to stay just on the comfortable side of that line. Pete paused. Having you here might change things. They'll have heard by now. Clark thought about that. He did not want to be a weapon. He had spent a decade being used as one, or almost being used as one, and he was done with it. He had come here to work, not to be a deterrent. But he also thought about Cora Ramsey's fence being cut in the dark of a January night by men who thought they could wear down a woman's resolve through small cruelties, and something tightened in his jaw. The encounter with Hayes Dalton came on a Thursday afternoon near the end of April. Clark was working the creek pasture when he heard horses and looked up to see 2 riders coming along the south edge of the property line. He recognized Hayes Dalton from Walt's description, a tall man with a thick copper-colored mustache and the easy posture of someone who expected to get what he wanted. The man with him was Boyd, shorter, narrower, with a pinched look around the eyes. Clark kept working. He had a fence post to set, and he set it, the heavy iron bar driving the post into the creekside earth doing his job. But he watched them in his peripheral vision, tracking their angle, and when they pulled up at the fence he straightened and faced them. "She hire you," Hayes said without preamble. "Mrs. Ramsey hired me, yes," Clark said. Hayes looked him over the way men looked at other men when they were deciding whether to be afraid or not. Clark watched him run the calculation and reach an answer that was somewhere between cautious and contemptuous, a man who had heard the stories and was trying to decide how much of them to believe. "Smart woman, finally getting herself some backup," Hayes said, and the way he said it was designed to imply something. "She's a smart woman in every respect," Clark said, and his voice was level and entirely without the edge that would have escalated things. Just agreeable, just factual. Hayes smiled with one side of his mouth. "You tell her Hayes Dalton came by and is still interested in having a conversation about that creek parcel." "I'll tell her you came by," Clark said. Hayes looked at him a moment longer, seemed to decide that pushing further was not worth whatever it might cost, and turned his horse. Boyd followed without having said a word. Clark watched them go, then turned back to the fence post and drove it the rest of the way into the ground. That evening he knocked at the kitchen house door and told Cora that Hayes Dalton had been by. She listened with her arms folded, and a small vertical line between her brows that he was learning meant she was thinking hard rather than angry, though it looked like both. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him you were a smart woman and I'd pass on the message." The vertical line between her brows eased slightly, and that was all. "That was all. I was setting fence." She studied him for a moment. "Some men in your position might have tried to run him off." "It's your property," Clark said. "Not my call to make." Something moved across her face that she did not entirely succeed in keeping neutral. She turned to the stove and moved a pot from one side to the other. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae," she said. "Clark," he said, and immediately felt foolish about saying it because it was too personal and too soon. But she said after a small pause, "Thank you, Clark." And the way she said his name, quietly and with a kind of careful consideration, like she was setting it somewhere she intended to remember it, did something to his breathing that he had to concentrate to correct. He said good night and walked back across the yard to the bunkhouse, and Pete Briggs, who was sitting on the step whittling, did not say anything, but he was definitely smiling. May came in with warm days and late afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the Kansas plains with the grandeur of something alive. Clark had been at the Ramsey ranch for nearly 5 weeks, and Caldwell had begun to settle around him the way towns did when they decided a man was staying. People who had avoided eye contact on the street were now nodding. Walt at the Dusty Bell had started having his coffee ready when Clark came in on Saturday evenings. Even Sheriff Meade, a quietly capable man of about 50 with a silver badge and steady gray eyes, had stopped in at the ranch one afternoon to introduce himself and had talked to Clark with the sort of measured friendliness that meant, "I've heard about you, I'm watching, but so far so good." Clark rode into town with Cora on the first Tuesday of May because one of the wagon wheels needed the wheelwright's attention, and she was going to open the apothecary for the week's 3 days. He drove the wagon and she sat beside him on the seat, and the 6-mile drive into town was the longest uninterrupted time they had spent in proximity, and Clark was acutely aware of every inch of it. She talked as they drove. She was not a woman who filled silence with nothing, but she was also not a woman who was uncomfortable talking, and she talked with the same quality she brought to everything, directly, substantively, as if conversation were worth the effort of doing properly. She told him about the history of the land, how her husband Thomas had bought it in 1874 with money from an inheritance and 2 years of trail work, how they had built the house together, how he had died of typhoid fever in the harsh winter of 1875, leaving her 32 head of cattle, a half-finished barn, and 600 acres of the most demanding and beautiful land she had ever seen. "Were you afraid?" Clark asked. "When you realized you were going to have to run it yourself?" She considered this seriously. "I was afraid I wouldn't be competent," she said, "but I wasn't afraid of the work itself or of people thinking I couldn't do it. I decided early that other people's doubt was not my problem." He looked at the road ahead and thought about that. "You're not afraid of much," he said. It came out as an observation, not a compliment, though it was both. She glanced at him. "What gives you that impression?" "The day I rode into Caldwell," he said. "Everyone else went inside. You stood in your doorway and watched me like I was a weather pattern you were studying." There was a pause, and then she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the small controlled amusement she allowed herself sometimes, but a real laugh, warm and a little surprised at itself, and it struck him somewhere in the middle of his chest like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. "I had work to do," she said, when the laugh had settled, "and I did not see anything in you that required me to stop doing it. Most people see something in me that requires them to stop doing quite a lot," he said. "Most people," she said, "are very quick to decide what they're seeing." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily down the road and the morning was clear and blue above the spring grass. "The reputation isn't nothing," he said. "Some of it is earned." "I know," she said, "but a reputation is a story other people tell. What matters is the story you're still writing." She said it simply, without philosophy for the sake of it, and he thought she probably believed it the way she believed in the efficacy of willow bark and the importance of mending fence before winter. He pulled the wagon up in front of the wheelwright's shop and set the brake and got down to help her down. And when he took her hand to steady her from the step, he felt the roughness of her palm. Working hands, capable hands, and she felt him notice it because she gave him a look that was daring him to comment on it. And he did not say a word, only let go of her hand and tipped his hat, and she straightened her dress and went to open her shop. Clark left the wagon with the wheelwright and walked the town for a while, picking up a few supplies from the general store, finding Pete's tobacco, which the old man had asked him to fetch. He was coming out of the store when he almost walked directly into a woman coming up the boardwalk steps, and he caught her arm to keep her from stumbling, and she looked up at him with wide eyes and then looked at his gun belt and went white. "I beg your pardon," he said immediately, releasing her arm and stepping back. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said quickly, and moved past him with quick steps. He stood on the boardwalk and watched her go and felt the familiar lowering weight of it. He was not angry. He had been angry about it once, years ago. Now it was just a fact of his life, like the scar along his left forearm or the way his right knee ached in cold weather. Across the street, through the apothecary window, he could see Cora at the counter, talking to a customer. She happened to look up at that moment, and across the street and through the glass her eyes found his, and she did not look away from him with pity or discomfort. She simply saw him, standing there, and her gaze was steady and matter-of-fact, and she turned back to her customer. He thought, standing there on the boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, with the May sun warm on his shoulders, "This is a dangerous situation." He thought, "I should be more careful." He thought, "I am not going to be more careful, and I know it." He was right on all three counts. The following week, Eli Hooper, who had the romantic sensibility of a very earnest young colt, noticed the way Clark watched Cora when she was not looking, and nudged Pete Briggs about it during supper. "You see how he gets when she comes across the yard," Eli said, with the theatrical subtlety of someone who is 19 years old. Pete looked at Eli over his tin cup. "Boy, if you say one word about it to either of them before it's ready to be said, I will have you mucking the South Corral for a month." Eli shut his mouth. Pete looked at Clark, who had apparently been focused entirely on his beans throughout this exchange. Clark looked up, met Pete's eyes, and returned to his beans. "Good," Pete said to no one in particular. It was not entirely up to Clark, though, because the situation had its own momentum, and momentum had a way of carrying things. It was a Wednesday evening in the middle of May when it tipped. Cora had come back from her last day at the apothecary to find a note left on the kitchen table by Eli, who had ridden into town to see a friend. The note said that the creek fence on the northeast corner was down and cattle had drifted, and that he had gone to look but could not find all of them before dark came, and that 2 calves were still missing. Clark had already gone to look when Cora came to the bunkhouse door. Pete told her where he was and she rode after him, alone, which was her habit and her right. She found him at the northeast corner in the last light, knee-deep in the creek brush, coaxing a calf back up the bank with patient, practiced calm. The calf was mired slightly in creek mud and frightened, and Clark was talking to it in a low, steady voice, the kind of voice that animals trusted before they had any reason to, which said something. The second calf was already on the bank, standing close to Duchess and looking bewildered. Cora got down from her horse without speaking and went to the other side of the creek brush to help angle the calf toward the bank, and between the two of them they had it out of the mud and up the bank within a few minutes. Clark was wet to the knee and had creek mud on his forearms, and Cora had a smear of mud on her cheek from where the calf had flung its head. They stood on the bank in the fading light with two rescued calves between them and the creek, talking over the stones below. And Clark looked at her in the way that he had been working hard not to do directly. She had the mud on her cheek and her hat was slightly crooked and she was breathing a little fast from the exertion, and she was looking at him with that clear, direct gaze, and he saw the moment when something in her expression changed, when the steady openness of it became something more specific, more aware, and she looked at him not as her ranch hand but as Clark. "You've been cutting this fence," she said, and it took him a second to realize she was talking about the Daltons. "I expect so," he said. "This is the third time." "Yes," she looked at the creek, then back at him. "I'm not going to sell to them. I know, and I'm not going to be frightened into selling." "I know that too," he said, and it came out with a warmth he did not entirely succeed in containing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You have creek mud in your hair." He reached up and felt the side of his head. "I expect so." "Come up to the house," she said. "You can wash up at the pump, and there's supper." It was a practical invitation, practically stated, and he told himself that clearly as he followed her and the calves back up toward the house. It was practical. It was simply practical. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread that she had baked that morning, and the lamp on the table cast a golden light that made everything in the room look like something worth keeping. Clark washed at the pump outside the kitchen door, and came in to find her moving efficiently between the stove and the table, setting out cornbread and a pot of stewed beef and 2 cups of coffee, and it was so ordinary and so profoundly domestic that it felt like being handed something fragile. They ate together at the kitchen table, with the lamp between them and the Kansas night pressing dark and wide against the windows, and the conversation moved the way good conversations did, from the practical to the personal, without either of them quite charting the course. He told her about growing up in southern Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys, how he had gone west at 17 with a brother who died of a fever 2 years later, how the trail work had started as necessity and become identity before he understood the difference. She told him about her father's medical practice, about sitting in on his appointments from the time she was old enough to be quiet and useful, about learning that the human body was a remarkable and deeply inconvenient thing that kept right on needing things regardless of the hour or the weather. "You could have stayed in Missouri," he said, "after Thomas died, gone back to your family." "My father was gone by then," she said. "My mother had remarried and moved to Ohio. I had sisters I loved, but we were not close in the way that makes that kind of dependence possible." She set her cup down. "And I did not want to go back. I wanted the thing I had come here for." "What was that?" She considered him. "This," she said simply. "The land, the work, the being the one who decides." She paused. "Thomas was a good man and I loved him truly, but I think I always knew that I needed to be somewhere I could be myself fully without the softening that polite society requires of women." He was quiet, thinking about that. "You are yourself," he said, "fully. I've been watching." She raised her eyebrows very slightly. "Watching." "Working," he said. "Working near someone, you notice things." There was a pause that felt charged and soft at the same time, and then she smiled, and this smile was different from the others, wider, reaching her eyes, which turned out to be dark hazel in the lamplight rather than the dark brown he had thought. And he thought that this was exactly the problem he had identified on the first day of driving fence and had done absolutely nothing about. "You have been thinking about this," she said. It was not quite a question, and he did not treat it as one. "Since the day I rode into town," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That was 5 weeks ago." "Yes." "You said nothing." "You're my employer," he said, "and I'm trying to be better than my history." The softness in her face deepened into something deliberate. "Clark," she said, "I stood in my doorway and watched you ride into this town because I had heard of you for 2 weeks before you arrived, from various people with various agendas, and I decided to see for myself what was there instead of flinching at the story." She folded her hands on the table. "I have seen, and what is there is not frightening to me." He was very still. "I would like to know you better," she said, and the directness of it, the Cora Ramsey nature of it, stating the thing plainly and without the armor of indirection, was so exactly like her that it felt like the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. "I would like that too," he said. She nodded, as though they had reached a practical agreement, which in a way they had. Then she stood and began clearing the supper things, and he helped her, and they washed the dishes together at the basin with the lamp warming the kitchen and the Kansas night outside. And when he left to walk back to the bunkhouse, she stood on the porch and watched him go, and he looked back once, and she was still there. He slept better than he had since Texas. The courtship that followed was the Cora Ramsey kind of courtship, which meant it was practical and genuine, and moved at a pace that had to do with what was actually there rather than with what was expected. They rode together on the morning rounds when work permitted. She showed him the north boundary of the land, the places where the grass grew thickest, the way the creek bent east past the stand of ash trees that she said she planned to expand someday. He told her about the different cattle operations he had worked, the good ranchers and the bad ones, the things he had learned about land stewardship from each. They talked with the ease of people who had discovered they were interested in the same things for the same reasons, and the talking was itself a kind of intimacy. She rode with him into Caldwell on the first Saturday of June, when he went to buy a new pair of work gloves at the general store. He walked with her down the boardwalk and noticed the way people looked at them and then looked harder, recalibrating. Clark McCrae, the dangerous drifter, walking beside the widow Ramsey. He heard the whispers and ignored them because he was good at that, but he noticed her lift her chin and ignore them too, and the small synchronicity of it pleased him. She bought a bolt of blue calico for a new work dress and a packet of dried herbs from the general store's depleted selection, and he carried the bolt of calico for her without being asked, and she let him, and when their hands brushed over it she did not pull away. June moved forward. The summer work was hard and constant, and he threw himself into it with a will, because he had something to work for now that was more than wages. The cattle were moved to the summer pasture. A portion of the barn floor was relaid. He helped Cora doctor a steer with a respiratory illness using a combination of her practical veterinary knowledge and his experience with trail sickness, and the steer recovered, and they were both unreasonably pleased about it. The Dalton trouble continued in a low-grade way, 2 more fence cuts, a water trough on the eastern edge knocked over, small malicious things that were designed to accumulate. Clark documented each one with time and location, writing it in a small leather-covered notebook with methodical care, and showed the notebook to Sheriff Meade on a Saturday afternoon. Meade read the entries carefully, his expression tightening. "This is good work," he said. "Circumstantial still, but it forms a pattern that I can take to the county judge." "What would that get her?" Clark asked. "Potentially a formal warning with legal consequences for further harassment. It won't stop men like the Daltons entirely, but it raises the stakes." Meade looked at him. "You're not going to handle this yourself." "That's not who I'm trying to be," Clark said. Meade studied him for a long moment with those steady gray eyes. "Good," he said at last. "Because it would undo everything you're building out there." Clark said nothing to that, but he felt it. Meade did take the pattern of evidence to the county judge in late June, and Hayes Dalton was called into Wichita for a formal hearing at which he denied everything smoothly and with practiced charm. But the judge issued a written warning, and the fence cutting stopped. Cora received a copy of the judge's letter with the formality and specificity of her nature, read it twice, folded it, and placed it in a tin box on the kitchen shelf. "Thank you," she said to Clark that evening, and he understood she was thanking him for the notebook, for the method of it. "It was the right way," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It was." She was standing at the kitchen door in the early evening light, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were full and green and moving in the slight breeze, and she looked out at her land with an expression of quiet, proprietorial love that he recognized because he had begun to feel something similar for every inch of it, and he stood beside her and looked at the same thing. "I want to stay," he said. It came out quiet and plain, the way important things had to be said to be real. She turned to look at him. "As a hand. As whatever you'll have me," he said, and he said it looking at her directly, the way she had taught him to, because she had shown him by example that things said plainly were the things that mattered. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she put her hand up against his chest, flat-palmed, and left it there, and he felt his heartbeat under her hand and was certain she could feel it too. "I'll have you," she said, "if you are asking what I think you are asking." "I am asking it," he said. She left her hand there one more moment. Then she moved it and turned and went inside and said from inside the kitchen, "Come in for supper, Clark. Pete and Eli will be along." He stood on the porch step for exactly 3 seconds, smiling at the cottonwood trees, before he went in. There was no dramatic declaration, no sweeping gesture, no moonlit speech. There was supper at the kitchen table with Pete and Eli, who both pretended not to notice anything different about the evening, and who were both so obviously noticing everything different about the evening that it was almost comical. There was conversation about the north pasture and whether the late summer grass would be sufficient. There was cornbread and coffee, and the sound of the Kansas evening coming in through the open window. After supper, Pete and Eli went back to the bunkhouse, and Clark stayed to help with the washing up, and when the last cup was dried and the lamp was burning low, Cora looked at him over the table and said, "I have not done this before. Not the being a widow part, the choosing part." "What do you mean?" he asked. "Thomas and I were matched by our families in the way that was reasonable and proper. We came to love each other, and I do not diminish that. But I did not choose him the way I am choosing you, with my full knowledge of what I am doing and why." She paused. "I want you to know that, the difference, what it means." He crossed the kitchen and he stood in front of her and he said, "Cora." And he said her name the way she had said his that first evening, as though it were something he intended to keep. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that was not quite the steady composure she wore as naturally as other people wore their skin. There was something there that was hopeful and vulnerable and exhilarated, and he thought it might be the bravest thing he had ever seen on a person's face. He kissed her gently, with the care that something fragile required, and she kissed him back with the directness of Cora Ramsey, thoroughly and without halfway measures. When they stepped back from each other, the lamp had burned lower and the kitchen was warm, and the night was full outside the windows. "Good night, Clark," she said. "Good night, Cora," he said. He walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the Kansas grass moving in the warm night wind, and he sat on the bunkhouse step for a long time before he went inside, because the sky was extraordinary and he was not quite ready to stop being alone with everything he was feeling. Pete Briggs was awake in his bunk in the dark. Clark knew this because Pete made no sound when he was awake, and a very specific kind of no sound when he was awake and trying not to acknowledge it. "Go to sleep, Pete," Clark said quietly. "I've been asleep," Pete said, not convincingly. Clark lay back on his bunk and looked at the bunkhouse ceiling and smiled at it. The summer moved on and deepened, and the ranch prospered the way things prosper when everyone working them is invested in the outcome. Clark's $12 a month became a different kind of conversation in August, when Cora sat down with him after supper, alone in the kitchen, and put a piece of paper on the table between them that turned out to be a rough accounting of the ranch's finances. "I want to talk about the future," she said, "practically." He had been expecting this in the way you expected the season to change, knowing it was coming and still being slightly surprised by the specific moment. He looked at the paper. The ranch was solvent, modestly profitable, with room to grow if a few things were done right. "I've been thinking about the east pasture," he said. "If we put another 40 head in spring and extended the fence line to take in the meadow past the ash trees, the grass would support it." She looked at him. Yes, she looked at the paper. "If you were to, over time, put your wages back into the operation in exchange for a share of the property, it would make the expansion possible faster." He thought about this carefully. "That's a different kind of arrangement than employment," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." "Are you asking me to be your partner?" He said. "I'm asking you to consider whether that is what you want," she said, and she was looking at him with those clear hazel eyes, and he understood that she was asking more than one question with the one question, and that she knew he understood, and that this was the Cora Ramsey way of proposing, which was in keeping with everything he loved about her. "Cora," he said, "I would like to ask you something before we talk about the financial arrangements." She waited. "Will you marry me?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in one of the cottonwoods. "Yes," she said. "I will." He exhaled slowly. "Good, now let's talk about the east pasture." She laughed, that full, warm, real laugh that still did the same thing to him it had done the first time he heard it. And they bent over the paper together and planned the ranch's future with their heads nearly touching over the lamp. They told Pete and Eli the next morning, and Pete said, "Good," with the satisfaction of a man who has been holding this particular opinion for months and is relieved to finally have it confirmed. Eli, who was constitutionally incapable of understatement, threw his hat in the air. They married in September of 1878 in the small church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street with the peeling white paint, and the minister, who was a serious young man of good intentions. Pete stood with Clark and a neighbor woman named Ruth Alderson, who had become friendly with Cora over the spring and summer, stood with Cora. Sheriff Meade came as a guest and shook Clark's hand afterward with a grip that communicated both congratulations and a certain quiet, professional satisfaction. Walt from the Dusty Bell attended and looked at Clark with the expression of a man revising a long-held opinion in real time. Cora wore a dress she had made herself from the blue calico bolt Clark had carried for her back in June, and she had a small arrangement of late summer wildflowers pinned at her collar, and she stood at the front of the church and looked at Clark coming down the aisle with the level, clear gaze that he now knew meant she was feeling something large, and had decided to feel it fully rather than diminish it. And he thought that he had never been looked at with such complete and undefended clarity by any person in his life, and he thought that he would spend the rest of his life working to deserve it. The minister asked if anyone knew a reason these two should not be joined, and nobody said anything, and Clark privately felt that the absence of objection from this particular town, which had found him frightening 4 months ago, was its own small ceremony. He said his vows and she said hers, and her voice was steady and certain and no louder than it needed to be, and he said his the same way. And that steadiness was the thing that moved him most, because he understood that for both of them it was not the easiness of certainty but the strength of it. That fall they began the expansion of the east pasture fence line together, working side by side through the cool October days with Pete and Eli, laying post and wire across the grass with the slow, satisfying accumulation of work that means something. The mornings had the particular cold clarity that came to the Kansas plains in October, the sky an intense blue above the curring grass, and Clark found himself stopping sometimes to look at it, the breadth of the land and the creek catching the light, and Cora 40 yards away swinging a post-hole digger with her hat pulled low and her breath fogging in the cold. And he thought that this was the thing he had been riding toward for 11 years without knowing what it was called. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table together. She read and he worked on the accounting books, which he had taken over from her because he had a facility for numbers she had not expected, and she had accepted his offer to manage the books with her characteristic practical willingness to allocate tasks to whoever could best perform them. They talked and sometimes did not talk. They built a fire when the October nights cooled, and the sound of it in the stone fireplace was company enough for long stretches. He was happy. He had not known quite what the word meant before, or had known it only abstractly, the way you know the names of places you have never been. Now it was specific and located in these rooms, and this land and this woman. October passed into November, and the herd was moved to winter pasture, and the house was prepared for the Kansas winter. Pete spent a week recaulking the bunkhouse, and Clark spent a week banking the house foundations with straw bales and making sure the window frames were tight. Cora kept the apothecary open 3 days a week through winter, because the need did not diminish with the season, and Clark drove her in when the weather permitted and waited at the dusty bell with a coffee, and she came to find him when she was done, and the walk back to the wagon was his favorite part of those town days. On a cold November afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and smelled like snow, Cora told him she was expecting a child. She said it at the kitchen table while he was working on the books, and she said it with her hands folded in front of her and her chin level, and he looked up from the ledger and put down his pen and looked at her for a long time. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, because he knew her medical knowledge and he knew that she would have a clear assessment of her own condition. "I am quite well," she said. "I estimate late May or early June." He came around the table and she stood up and he put his arms around her carefully, as if she might be more fragile now, and she made a small noise of mild impatience at the careful part and put her arms around him properly, and they stood in the kitchen with the November wind against the windows. "I am very happy," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "So am I." He felt her smile against his shoulder. "Though," she said, in the practical tone that she used for all matters, "there will need to be adjustments to the spring work schedule because I intend to keep working." "Of course," he said. "And I will need to stop making the ride into Caldwell at some point, which means we will need to think about how we manage the apothecary days." "We'll figure it out," he said. "We will," she agreed, and settled against him. That winter was long and cold the way Kansas winters could be, with hard freezes and periodic snowstorms that kept everyone close to the buildings, and required the kind of steady daily attention to the livestock that was exhausting but grounding. Clark and Pete spelled each other through the cold barn checks, and Eli, who was turning 20 in January, took on the job with a new seriousness that spoke well of him. Cora managed the household and the apothecary days she could make, and the medical needs of the neighboring homesteaders who came to her when the weather closed the road to Wichita. There was a family 3 miles east, the Wheelers, who had a daughter with a persistent lung ailment, and Cora drove out to see her twice through the January cold with Clark driving, and a box of medicines and dried herbs in the back of the wagon. She sat with the girl for 2 hours each time, administering treatments and showing the mother what to do, and Clark waited in the Wheeler kitchen drinking the family's thin coffee and talking crops with the father, who was a cautious but kind man trying to hold his homestead claim together against the competing pressures of debt and weather and the general difficulty of the Kansas plains. On the second visit, coming home through the gray January afternoon, Cora was quiet for a long time. "She's improving," she finally said. "The lung inflammation is responding." "That's good," he said. "It would not have responded if her mother hadn't caught it when she did and come to me immediately." She paused. "This place needs a physician, a real one, not just me." "You're better than nothing by considerable margin," he said. "That is a low bar." "I meant it as a compliment." She glanced at him sideways. "I know what you meant." She pulled her coat closer against the cold. "I've been writing to a medical college in St. Louis. There's a man, recently graduated, looking for a practice location. I've asked the town council to consider raising funds for a proper clinic." He looked at her. "When did you start doing that?" "October," she said. "I presented it at the town council meeting on the 15th. I did mention it to you." He tried to remember. "You mentioned you were going to a town council meeting." "Yes, and I mentioned why." He thought about it. He had been in the middle of the accounting. "I may have been insufficiently attentive." "You frequently are when the ledger is in front of you," she said, not unkindly. "I'll do better," he said. "See that you do," she said. Then she put her head against his arm for exactly a moment, the way she sometimes allowed herself to be soft when it was just the two of them and no one watching, and then she sat up straight again and looked at the road home. The young physician from St. Louis, a man named Daniel Harper, arrived in Caldwell in March of 1879 on the back of the stage, looking somewhat dazed by the journey and entirely uncertain about what he had agreed to. He was 26 years old and earnest and well-trained, and Cora sat with him for a full afternoon at the apothecary, going over the community's medical needs with the thoroughness of a woman who had been doing the job alone and intended to hand it over properly. Clark met him briefly and thought he seemed like a good young man who would grow into the place if the place gave him a chance. He shook Harper's hand and told him the town was lucky to have him, and Harper looked surprised to be receiving this sentiment from the man the town had once found alarming. The spring came and the east pasture fence line, which they had completed in November, was now holding 42 new head of cattle that Clark had purchased at the late winter market in Wichita with money that was now as much his as hers because the partnership was legal and formal and registered with the county. The grass was coming in green and strong, and the creek was running clear and cold with the snowmelt, and the cottonwood trees were putting out their first leaves, and Cora was visibly, unmistakably expecting, and she continued to manage the ranch with her full capability, which she did until the end of April, when Clark convinced her to let Eli take over the corral work by making the argument that it was a matter of operational efficiency rather than any concern about her physical condition, which was the only argument she was likely to accept. She accepted it with a slightly raised eyebrow that said she was not entirely fooled, but she accepted it. Their son was born on the 1st of June, 1879, a Monday morning when the light was gold and the cottonwoods were in full leaf. He was born with a substantial voice and his father's dark hair and his mother's straight black brows already firmly in evidence, which made Cora laugh through her exhaustion. Dr. Harper delivered him with skill and care, and Clark, who had been consigned to the porch for the actual event by a firm but gentle Harper and a very firm Cora, came inside when called and stood at the bedside looking at the two of them, his wife propped against the pillows looking tired and beautiful and entirely herself, and the small dark-haired person in the crook of her arm who was regarding the world with an expression of alert, analytical suspicion. "Hello," Clark said to his son. The baby looked at him. The analytical suspicion seemed to deepen slightly. "He's not frightened of you," Cora said. Clark looked at her. She was smiling, tired and radiant, and her eyes were wet, which was the first time he had ever seen that, and it undid him completely in the best way. "What will we call him?" he asked. "I thought Thomas," she said. "For Thomas Ramsey, it seems right." "Thomas McCrae," he said, trying the weight of it. "Thomas McCrae," she confirmed. He reached out and put one finger against his son's small fist, and the fist closed around it with the automatic, fierce grip of the very new. And Clark thought that there was nothing in his history, not the trail miles or the dust, or the sunrises over open country, or the 1 or 2 moments of genuine beauty he had collected over 28 years on this earth, that had prepared him for this specific and overwhelming thing. Pete Briggs, when told the news, went immediately to the barn and stayed there for 20 minutes. He came back red-eyed and pretended it was the dust. Eli Hooper was so delighted he fell off the corral fence, which he had climbed to celebrate, and landed in the dirt and did not even notice because he was laughing. The summer that followed was the fullest and the busiest of Clark's life, and it was the summer he finally understood that this, all of this, was the life he had been building without a blueprint for 11 years. The ranch expanded. The cattle did well. The grass held through a dry July because the creek was reliable and Cora's careful land management had preserved the soil. Dr. Harper had set up a small clinic in a building the town council had funded with an effort that Cora had largely organized through correspondence and sheer persistence. And Caldwell had a physician, which meant Cora could let go of the community medical responsibility she had carried for 3 years and return to the apothecary purely as her own enterprise and her pleasure. Hayes Dalton attempted one final gambit in August, appearing at the ranch gate with his lawyer, and a new, higher offer for the creek parcel, framed as a neighborly gesture. Cora came out of the house with Thomas on her hip and Clark standing beside her, not forward beside her, and she looked at Hayes Dalton across the gate with the same clear, unwavering gaze she had turned on everything from frightening reputations to stuck fence posts. "Mr. Dalton," she said pleasantly, "this is not for sale. The answer has not changed and it will not change. I hope you will make your peace with that and I wish you a good afternoon." Hayes looked at Clark. Clark looked back at him with an expression that was not a threat and contained no threat. It was simply the expression of a man who was standing next to his wife. Hayes Dalton looked at the baby on Cora's hip, who was regarding him with the family's characteristic combination of interest and composure. Hayes tipped his hat. He turned his horse. He rode away, and his lawyer rode with him, and he did not come back again. Pete Briggs, who had watched from the barn door, walked back into the barn making a sound that might have been a laugh. The autumn of 1879 came in with the wide, brilliant blue skies that were the Kansas plains' most spectacular gift. And the grass cured to gold and the cottonwoods went yellow, and the cattle were fat and the books, which Clark balanced on the kitchen table 3 evenings a week, showed a modest and real profit. They expanded the bunkhouse in October to accommodate a second new hand, a steady young man from Ohio named Gabriel Marsh, because the herd now required more consistent attention, and Pete and Eli had been stretching thin through the summer. Eli, who was 21 now, had grown into a genuinely capable cowhand, and Clark had begun teaching him the accounting basics because everyone on this ranch, Clark had decided, should understand where the numbers were going. Cora, watching this one evening from the doorway, looked at Clark over Eli's bent head and the ledger between them, with an expression that he had learned over the course of a year to read as pride, the private, personal kind that she did not announce but simply felt. He caught her eye and she looked away, back into the kitchen, and he heard her singing to Thomas, who was 4 months old and had discovered that the world was full of interesting sounds and intended to participate in all of them. The winter of 1879 was milder than the previous one, and the ranch came through it in good condition. Thomas grew with the energetic purposefulness of a healthy child who had decided the world was entirely his to investigate, and he was mobile and opinionated by the following spring in ways that kept everyone on the property slightly more alert than they might otherwise have been. He was 3 weeks shy of his first birthday when Pete Briggs sat down with Clark on the bunkhouse step one evening and said, without particular preamble, that he was thinking of heading back to Missouri. Clark was quiet for a moment. "Missouri? I've got a sister there," Pete said. "I haven't seen her in 8 years. I'm 64 years old and I figure the time for putting things off has a shorter window than I'd like to think." He looked at the late spring evening with his characteristic economy of expression. "This place is yours and hers now, proper and right. It doesn't need me the way it needed me 3 years ago." "It'll always need you," Clark said. Pete looked at him. "No," he said, not unkindly. "It won't. That's what you've built here." He paused. "It's the best kind of thing to say about a place." Clark sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "When are you thinking?" "End of June," Pete said. "After the summer pasture move." Clark nodded. "That's fair." He paused. "I'll miss you." "You're a sentimental man," Pete said, in the tone that meant he was one too. They told Cora together at supper the next evening, and she listened with the focused stillness she gave to important things, and then she said she was sorry to lose him, and that she understood completely, and that she was going to make him the best supper they had resources for on his last night, and that if he ever came back through Caldwell, he was to come directly to this ranch and she would not hear otherwise. Pete looked at his plate. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in the voice of a man who had just been given exactly what he needed. Eli took Pete's departure hard but quietly, and Gabriel Marsh proved a steady, dependable presence that helped fill the gap of Pete's practical knowledge if not his company. Clark wrote to a cousin in Texas who had mentioned being tired of the trail, a man named Harrison McCrae who was 26 and reliable, and Harrison arrived in July with his saddle and his strong back, and settled into the bunkhouse with the ease of someone who has been looking for a place to land. The ranch moved into its second full year of expanded operation with the solid, forward-leaning energy of a going concern, and Clark found himself, at 29 years old, in the position of being the kind of man he had not thought he was allowed to become. A settled man, a husband, a father, a partner, A man with roots deep enough in one piece of ground that the wind could move him but could not uproot him. They celebrated Thomas's first birthday on a warm June day, with a gathering that included Ruth Alderson and her husband, Dr. Harper, who had become a genuine part of the community in his first year, Sheriff Meade, who arrived with a carved wooden horse for Thomas and the dignified awkwardness of a man who was not practiced at birthday parties, and Eli and Harrison and Gabriel. Cora made a pound cake with molasses, and everyone ate on the porch in the June afternoon, while Thomas regarded the carved horse with intense suspicion, and then put it immediately in his mouth. "He's methodical," Dr. Harper said, watching. "He gets that from her," Clark said. Cora, who was beside him, said, "He gets it from both of us." "True," Clark said. She leaned against his shoulder briefly in the afternoon light, and he put his arm around her, and Sheriff Meade saw it and looked away with the expression of a man who was privately pleased about what this town had become, because it had not always been a place where things like this happened. That evening, when the guests had gone and Eli and Harrison and Gabriel were in the bunkhouse and Thomas was asleep in the house, Clark and Cora sat on the porch in the last of the light, which was the warm amber gold of a Kansas June evening, and the creek was audible in the quiet and the cottonwoods were moving softly. "Tell me something," Cora said. "What?" "Something you know now that you didn't know 2 years ago." He thought about it genuinely because she asked things genuinely and they deserved genuine answers. "That settling somewhere is not the end of something," he said. "I always thought it would be. The end of moving, the end of freedom, the end of the kind of life that went with being on the road. But it's not the end of anything. It's a different kind of beginning." He paused. "And that I was afraid for a long time of being known. Of someone looking at me without the distance of a reputation between us." He glanced at her. "You made that impossible." She looked at him. "How?" "You stood in that doorway," he said, "and you looked at me like there was nothing frightening there, and I could not stop thinking about that. I thought about it every day for weeks, because if you weren't afraid of me, then maybe there wasn't as much to be afraid of as I'd convinced myself, and that either meant the world was different than I thought or I was." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Or both." "Or both," he agreed. She put her hand on his, on the porch rail between them, and they sat like that while the light went slowly out of the sky and the stars came up one by one over the Kansas plains, enormous and bright and indifferent to everything small, and the land lay around them in its great silence. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was not without fear," she said. "When you rode in, I just decided it wasn't useful." She paused. "You were striking. And your reputation was frightening in the way. Any story of violence is frightening. But I was standing in my doorway looking at a man who was riding slowly down the middle of a street, not riding hard, not drawing attention, not trying to be what everyone expected. He was just trying to get to the livery stable." She turned to look at him. "I thought, here is a man who is tired of the story told about him. I know something about that feeling." He looked at her. "You do." A widow who runs her own ranch and her own business in 1878 is also living inside a story that other people find remarkable and that she finds simply like being herself," she said. "The town thought I was brave. I thought I was just doing what needed doing." She smiled. "Perhaps you were doing the same." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I was," he said, "though I was less clear about it than you." "You're getting clearer," she said. "I have good instruction," he said. She squeezed his hand. Above them the stars moved in their ancient, unhurried way, and the Kansas night was warm and wide. And inside the house Thomas McCrae, aged 1 year and 2 days, was sleeping with his mother's straight black brows and his father's dark hair and both of their stubborn, particular, capable natures, and the whole of it. The land and the house and the creek and the cottonwoods and the cattle and the stars and the two of them on the porch was complete and solid and real. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full. They were not without difficulty, because the frontier was not without difficulty and never would be. The winter of 1880 was harsh, and they lost 4 head, and spent a brutal 3 weeks managing frostbite and cold-related illness among the livestock, with the grim, practical commitment that life on the Kansas plains required. There was a drought scare in the summer of 1881 that had every ranching family along the Caldwell corridor tightening everything and watching the creek level with anxiety. And Clark organized a cooperation among 4 neighboring operations to manage the water resources fairly through the dry months, which earned him a respect in the community that came from practical demonstrated good sense, rather than from any story anyone was telling about him. That drought scare was the summer Cora told him she was expecting again, and the news was received with the same combination of joy and practical assessment of the additional workload as the first time, which felt entirely appropriate to who they were. Their second child was a girl, born in March of 1882 in a longer and more difficult labor that made Clark's time on the porch considerably more anxious than the first. Dr. Harper managed everything with skill and calm, and Cora came through it strong and tired, and the girl arrived with a furious, healthy cry and light brown eyes, and what Harper described as the best set of lungs he had encountered in 2 years of practice. They named her Margaret for Cora's mother. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had inherited the family quality of composure in the face of new information, examined his sister with serious attention and announced that she was very small. This was accurate. He then went back to the carved wooden horse, which he had named Harold, and which had survived 14 months of determined investigation with only one leg requiring regluing. The ranch by this point had grown to something of genuine scale. They ran 130 head, the east pasture and the original pastures working together, and the water from the creek was properly managed through a small irrigation system Clark had built from a design Cora had found in an agricultural journal she subscribed to from St. Louis. They had 4 hands working steady, Eli having settled into a senior role that he filled with a capability that still occasionally surprised him, and never surprised Clark or Cora. The town of Caldwell itself had grown, the way Kansas border towns grew in those years, quickly and in directions nobody fully predicted. The railroad spur from Wichita had extended, bringing new commerce and new complications. Dr. Harper had expanded his clinic and taken on a nurse. There was a second saloon and a school that Cora had been instrumental in organizing, sitting on the school board from its founding and serving as its most demanding and most effective advocate for 3 years running. The peeling white paint on the church had been replaced with new paint applied during a community work day that Clark had helped organize, and that Ruth Alderson had catered so comprehensively that people referred to it for months afterward. Clark McCrae was known in Caldwell in 1882 as a good rancher and a fair man, someone whose word meant something and whose opinion at the town council meetings, to which he had been appointed the previous year, was worth having. He was known as Cora Ramsey's husband, which was a description that carried considerable weight because Cora Ramsey was known as a capable, independent, educated, and profoundly useful member of the community who ran her apothecary and her ranch and her school board responsibilities with equal and formidable effectiveness. He was known as Thomas and Margaret's father. He was known, distantly and increasingly, as the man who had once ridden into town with a frightening reputation and had found the one woman in Caldwell who had not been moved by it, and that story had become the kind of fond local legend that settled around couples when the community has decided they belong to it. The old version of the story, the one about the gunfights and the danger, had not vanished. He knew that. A man's history did not vanish. But it had settled into the past where history belonged, no longer the first thing people thought of when they heard his name, no longer the thing that made people press themselves into doorways. On a September afternoon in 1882, Clark was in the east pasture checking on a section of fence with Thomas trotting beside him on his first pony, a small bay with white socks that Thomas had named Captain after a character in one of Cora's books, and the afternoon light was the particular gold of late Kansas summer sliding toward fall. Thomas was 4 years old and already absorbed in everything around him with the systematic curiosity that was entirely his mother's and the patience to wait and watch that might be his father's, and he was asking questions about the fence construction with the seriousness of someone who intended to master it. "Why does the wire need to be tight?" Thomas asked. "Because loose wire sags and cattle push through it," Clark said. "What if the cattle don't want to push through?" "Cattle want to go wherever the grass looks better," Clark said. "They don't think about fences." Thomas considered this. "Harold doesn't think about fences," he said, which was true, as Harold was a carved wooden horse and not burdened with the ambitions of actual livestock. "That's a different situation," Clark said. Thomas accepted this and looked across the pasture at the 130 head moving through the curring gold grass, and then he looked at his father with dark eyes that were Cora's eyes, seeing clearly and without the armor of expectation. "Papa," Thomas said. "Yes. Is this our land?" "Yes," Clark said. "Ours and Mama's and yours and Margaret's." Thomas seemed to sit with this. "And we keep it." "We keep it," Clark said. Thomas nodded with the gravity of a 4-year-old who has received important information and filed it appropriately. He turned Captain along the fence line and trotted ahead to look at something on the ground, and Clark watched him go, his small straight back and the pony's white socks bright in the afternoon light. He stood in the east pasture, with the fence line his hands had built, and the cattle that were half his to tend, and the creek audible somewhere to the south through the ash trees. And above him, the September sky of Kansas, was the limitless blue that he had once ridden under as a man who did not know where he was going. And he thought about a September morning 4 years ago, when he had ridden into a town on this same blue sky kind of day with a reputation, and a roan gelding, and nothing much else. And a woman had stood in a doorway and looked at him without fear. He thought about how that single moment had cracked something open in him, a door he had thought was closed and perhaps locked from the inside. How the straightness of her gaze and the total absence of flinching had done what 11 years of moving and working and surviving had not managed to do, which was to make him wonder if the story other people told about him was the story that was actually true. It was not the only story. He knew that now with the certainty of lived experience. He was also the man in the east pasture with his son on a September afternoon. He was the man at the kitchen table with the ledger and the lamp. He was the man who drove his wife to Caldwell on Tuesday mornings and waited at the Dusty Bell and felt something small and profound when she came to find him. He was the man who had organized the water cooperation in the drought summer and re-roofed the church and taught Eli Hooper to read a balance sheet. He was Thomas's father and Margaret's father and Cora's husband and Pete Briggs's friend and Harrison McCrae's cousin, and the man the town had decided to keep. He had come to understand, not only his worst moments. He was also these ones. Thomas had turned Captain around and was trotting back, something interesting discovered in the grass now examined and deemed sufficient. "A grasshopper," he reported, "a big one." "They get big in September," Clark said. "Do they bite?" "They can, but they mostly don't." Thomas filed this away. "Mama will want to know about it." "She probably already knows," Clark said. Thomas accepted this with equanimity. Mama knowing things was one of the reliable constants of his world, like the creek and the east pasture fence and Harold the horse and the smell of the kitchen at supper time. They rode back together toward the house as the afternoon began its slow lean toward evening, the light going golden and long across the grass, the house appearing at the end of the track with its covered porch and its flower boxes and the kitchen light warm in the window. And Cora came out onto the porch with Margaret on her hip, and she shaded her eyes against the afternoon light to watch them come, and she lifted her free hand in greeting. He raised his hand in return. Thomas kicked Captain into a slightly more ambitious trot. Clark rode toward his wife and his home in the gold light of a Kansas September, and the land was wide and beautiful around him, and the sky was enormous above him, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning their turn toward gold, and the world, imperfect and demanding and real as it was exactly what it needed to be. He reached the gate and dismounted and came up to the porch where Cora was standing, and she looked at him with those clear hazel eyes in the warm late light. And he thought what he had thought that very first day, standing in the middle of Caldwell's main street with his horse planted, and his heart tilted off its usual axis, that this woman was not afraid of him, and he could not stop thinking about that, and that everything that had happened since then had been the consequence of that single act of clear, undefended seeing, and that there was no greater gift one human being could give another than to simply look at them and not look away. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," he said, and stepped up onto the porch and kissed her in the September light while Thomas tied Captain to the hitching rail with the concentration of someone who had just learned the knot. Margaret, aged 6 months and possessed of opinions, grabbed a handful of Clark's shirt and held on, and Cora laughed against his cheek. Inside, the house supper was on the stove, and the Kansas evening was coming in warm through the open windows, and outside the land lay vast and gold and theirs, and the creek ran over its stones in the quiet, and the cottonwoods along its bank were turning, and everything was accounted for, and everything was home.